Hello and welcome. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today at this is our webinar number 19 for the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia based in New Delhi. My name is Munish Gupta. I am the secretary of the club, and we look forward to a very lively webinar and interaction on the role of UN at 75 and UN Women at 10. We have very special guests here with us that I would later request our president, Mr. S. Venkat Narayan, to introduce to the audience and all of us. But let me introduce the other panelists who are joining us today. Mr. Sanjeev Miglani, the Reuters India Bureau Chief right here in Delhi. We also have with us Veer Raghava from the Synergia Foundation in Bangalore. Purnima Sharma, who's an editorial coordinator for SCube TV from Delhi. Vichitra Sharma, a good friend and senior journalist from Delhi. Munish Chand, editor-in-chief of India Rights Network. Welcome to all, and over to you, Venkat, to introduce our special guests and to begin the webinar. Venkat, Mr. S. Venkat Narayan, the president of FCC South Asia.
Good evening, everybody. What a pleasure it is to be hosting the second seminar to celebrate the UN's 75th anniversary. As you all know, last week we had the pleasure of hosting Mr. Ban Ki-moon and three of India's most distinguished diplomats, Vijay Nambiar, Bashwata Mukherjee, and Syed Akbaruddin, talking about what the UN has achieved so far and what it proposes to do. And today we are delighted to have two very distinguished, accomplished lady diplomats from India and France. And a warm welcome to you, Lakshmi Puri. She has been executive editor of, director of the UNWomen, and earlier she worked for the Indian Foreign Service since 1974. She has worked in Japan, Sri Lanka, Switzerland, Hungary, and she hosted the first global summit on gender equality in which 70 heads of state and government attended, participated, and gave commitments. And so she's going to be talking about what lies ahead for the UN. And we also have Mrs. Renata Desalian. She is the UN resident coordinator in India for the United Nations. She has been with the UN for the last 30 years. Before arriving in India, she has worked in Bhutan, Bangladesh, China, Myanmar, Mali, Laos, and also in New York. She has a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University and a master's from Columbia University also, and she has a graduate degree in music from the University of Ottawa. So we are delighted to have you, ladies, and all my other colleagues who have already been introduced by my friend Munish. May I now invite Lakshmi to speak first. Lakshmi.
Thank you, Mr. Venkat Narayan, President of the FCC of South Asia, and Ms. Renata Desalian, RC of UN in India, and both my favorite people and all the distinguished panelists. Thank you for inviting me to share some thoughts on the most important justice project for humanity, that is gender equality and women's empowerment, with a particular focus on what UNWomen at 10, the dedicated entity of the United Nations and sole product of UN reform in the 21st century, has achieved and what needs to be done going forward. You know, when you ask me to do this, it's like asking a mother to describe her child, because I have had the privilege of nurturing this institution for 7 years out of its 10 since its founding. So let me say in all honesty that even before UNWomen, the UN can be credited with advancing equality and women's empowerment significantly in multiple ways. The Commission on the Status of Women, founded almost at the inception of the UN as a powerful organization of the Economic and Social Council, has played a sterling role as a unique, largest global platform to bring together policymakers and other stakeholders for dialogue and norms and standard setting on gender equality and women's empowerment. The transformative concept of gender mainstreaming and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, a treaty that is now signed by 189 out of 193 countries and holds them accountable to report on how they are upholding the tenets of this treaty, is a product of the Commission on Status of Women. 4 path-breaking UN World Conferences for Women were held, and the last Beijing Platform for Action is still a gold standard in government commitments 25 years later to advance women's rights in the 12 major areas of action, including poverty eradication, economy, education, health, violence against women, power and decision-making, environment, media. This is a very important area of action, by the way, and institutional mechanisms. That is, what kind of institutions serve this project. However, until the creation of UNWomen, the UN had a fragmented and weak gender architecture, no coordination and accountability of its agencies. Gender equality was not prioritized in their mandates or implementation. And there are more than 66 UN departments and agencies, including the BWIs, the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF. The global norms had no wings to fly and no feet to walk the ground and eyes to monitor. There was no Saraswati, I would say, or fount of gender equality and women's empowerment related multi-sectoral knowledge and global wisdom. Also, gender was ghettoized, if I would call it that, as a soft social matter, not integral to hard economic or war and peace issues. The women's movement had no powerful ally or interlocutor with governments, nor an intergovernmental mover or shaker of public opinion building to partner with. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which were operative from 2000 to 2015, did have an MDG on promoting gender equality and one on maternal mortality, but neither was comprehensive or transformative or cross-cutting. So what transformation did UNWomen bring about? Institutionally, 4 disparate units of the UN, small ones, were integrated into a standalone global organization bigger than the sum of its parts, with a wide-ranging mandate for norm setting, global, regional, and also supporting national, UN system coordination, a holistic knowledge and training hub, an engine for impactful programs on the ground in countries and regions, an influential advocate, and advocacy is a very important part of all of this because it's about mindset change, a vibrant partner and force multiplier of a people's movement for cultural and social norm change on gender equality, and that partnership with civil society. So in that avatar, UNWomen inspired millions of men and women, institutions and leaders, and very important, even men leaders everywhere, to value, own, and invest in gender equality within their families, communities, and as a national and global public good, essential to achieve, and this is a very important, I think, idea change that has been brought up, other critical public goods, to achieve other critical public goods. UNWomen enabled great leaps in global norms and standard setting on gender equality across core areas of economic empowerment, voice participation and leadership, ending violence against women, and promotion and protection of their human rights in every area. And then it reinforced what I call the motherboard of gender equality norms and standards, and push the frontiers in contested areas like sexual and reproductive health and rights, and traditional and customary harmful practices. It forged a veritable global gender equality compact among member states, private sector, and civil society based on these norms. It ensured that gender equality and women's empowerment is an end in itself, because that's very important, but it's also to be mainstreamed into every area of UN's main projects of humanity, which I call peace and security, including, and this is a very important addition, including countering violent extremism and terrorism, human rights, sustainable development, and disaster and humanitarian response. We made history. UNWomen made history, because that was my ex, made history by organizing the first ever global summit on gender equality with 70 heads of state, which Venkat referred to as head of state and government, and 165 countries committing at the highest level to implement the Gender Equality Compact. It got member states to adopt comprehensive, transformative, and a dedicated Sustainable Development Goal 5 on achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls, with 9 meaningful targets and cross-cutting targets and 11 other SDGs of Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. These were breakthrough commitments, and in areas, new concepts like valuing unpaid care work and domestic work that women do, but also calling for sharing and provision of that by partners and the state. Thorough Beijing Plus 20 and 25 reviews were organized. In fact, one is going on just now, globally, regionally, and at the national levels, with path-breaking gender equality resolutions in the UNGA, UN Security Council, that's a very big breakthrough, CSW, ECOSOC, and other UN bodies. And these were pursued, and they became high standards, what I call soft law. Rio Plus 20 conference agreement on sustainable development, Paris Climate Change Agreement, financing for development, Habitat 3 on urban development. These and other global agreements were engendered. That's the word now used to gender mainstreaming of something. Importantly, UNWomen led a UN system coordination juggernaut to get over 66 departments, specialized agencies, and the Bretton Woods institutions to submit to a gender equality policy and practice regime. The UN entities committed to making gender equality and women's empowerment an integral part of their missions, and to be held accountable to deliver for women and girls through innovative UN system-wide action plans. And they are also global and at country levels, for example, in India and elsewhere. And gender parity, the status of women in the organization, and also joined and led by SGUN, and I'm sure Renata will speak to that. UNWomen also ignited partnerships with what we call game changers, the private sector, the religious community, youth, men and boys, media, and academia. The private sector committed to women's empowerment principles in their companies, in the marketplace, and in the communities, and to SDG 5 implementation, and stock exchanges globally rang the bell for gender equality. Intra and interfaith platforms for positive interpretation of gender equality norms were established, and women religious advocates and leaders were encouraged. Youth LEAP strategy was used as an intergenerational pole vault into gender equal norms, because the youth can be that force. And that's why there is now a campaign going on what is called generational equality. The He for She movement was a remarkable success. In India, over 1.5 million young men signed up to it. And this is about men and young boys standing up for gender equality. Partnerships with old and new media on the portrayal, participation and leadership of women was also forged, and we have a media compact. The women's movement received unprecedented support and ballast, and public opinion was influenced through Step It Up for Planet 50/50 and several other advocacy campaigns and people's marches. We had one of the biggest people's marches in New York, but also globally. The international community can't be complacent and must press on with updating, deepening, and expanding these women's empowerment norms in every fora. That's what we must look forward to and press on. The Gender Equality Compact also must see a cascading translation into regional, national, and local laws, policies, and measures to benefit women and girls, and to create accountability of all stakeholders who UNWomen must convene with empowered women's organizations and self-help groups. These are very important partners. Also, we must do more to banish gender unjust and discriminatory psychosocial mindsets and dismantle structural barriers. All of these because we still have a long way to go. The 10th anniversary challenge for UNWomen is how to have more program presence on the ground and how to work with the rest of the UN to raise that impact. The task of dismantling centuries of gender discrimination is daunting. It's been neglected for so long. It is resource intensive. And now with the pandemic, it's crisis hobbled. And UNWomen is more needed than ever before. It must support countries, cities, and villages as what we call strategic precursors of prioritized and scaled up gender equality and women's empowerment action, and transformative financial investment. This is really something that is very, very important, including gender responsive budgeting and so on. Tech enablement, mass movement, and political commitment that the project needs and deserves from all stakeholders. Now, there is an understandable gap between women and girls' expectation of UNWomen's omnipresence and omnipotence and what resources it can muster and how it can reach into countries and homes, because that's also an issue. Can we go into every home and change the mindset and prevent injustice? But it must be provided both on an unprecedented scale and scope, both resources and reach. UNWomen's mission is still incomplete. Beijing Plus 25 Global Review has shown, and I would encourage you to look at the results of all the surveys that have been done, that the progress has been slow and the change is sluggish. The pandemic-related multi-sectoral crisis has added new challenges, including acceleration of tech economy 4.0 related future of work ones, so which threatens to increase the lag. UNWomen is engaged, I believe, in assessing the disproportionate and differential impact on women and girls, and to support government and multi-stakeholder strategies for mitigation and relief. I always talk about the three things: mitigation and relief, recovery and resilience, building back better and building anew, to ensure that they centrally incorporate women's empowerment purposes. And all of government and all of society commitment and action is now needed more than ever before. You know, UNWomen has tried to proselytize, if I may call it that, on the basis of what and how of achieving gender equality, as much as in the why of it. Preaching to convert governments and people everywhere to faith in the transformative potential of gender equality and women's empowerment, UNWomen has pointed to exponential gains for everyone. Win-win-win for everyone. First and foremost, the gains for women and girls themselves and to their communities are of a life of dignity and self-assurance, ability to make life choices, and freedom from violence, familial and societal harmony, and well-being of all. But working closely with academia, private sector, and others, UNWomen has been projecting the development benefits, the economic benefits of gender parity in all areas. And this really hits the right buttons in leaderships everywhere. And in terms of investment being made, the McKinsey Power of Parity study projecting 12 to 18 trillion US dollar increase in global GDP by 2025, this was in 2015, was one such study. Now, more recently, McKinsey has projected an 800 billion USD increase in India's GDP by 2025 based on gender parity. Now, this accretion is, as you can imagine, is indispensable for PM Modi's $5 trillion US dollar GDP by 2025 ambition and Atmanirbhar Bharat achievement. Similarly, UNWomen has provided proof of concept on the value of women's role in peacemaking and peace building in conflict areas ranging from Sudan to Afghanistan, and I would also add, say, climate change and other areas too. We have provided evidence that women's empowerment makes a difference. And a big one. I end with an anecdote about my New York UNWomen days. I was introduced to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at the height of our activism. He turned around and said, half in admiration, I guess, and I would like to believe, and half in zest, on the way UNWomen is going, all guns firing, we will need to have a UN Men, he said. I responded to him, don't worry, Excellency. Our intention is to reach a point of gender equality where neither UN women nor UN men would be needed. And that's the aspiration UNWomen has to continue to push for and work for. And I think the world should also be supporting this institution and working with this institution, investing in this institution to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lakshmi ji. That was, certainly it showed us that you've nurtured this organization very intimately, because you speak with so much depth, clarity, passion, conviction, and so many wonderful examples. And I can certainly tell you from what I have seen traveling around the world that there is no achieving or accomplishing the sustainable development goals without working on the issues relating to women empowerment and gender parity and gender equality. Let me quickly move on now to request Ms. Renata Desalegn, the UN resident coordinator in India, to join us. She is right now in France, and we wish to inform our audience that there is a little bit of a technical issue because there is a very big storm in the area that she is in. So unfortunately, bandwidth is an issue, so she would not be able to switch on her video. So we apologize for that, but we will listen to her, because if she switches on her video, then we lose her connection. So welcome, Renata. Please address us. Please have us. Please deliver your remarks.
Munish, just checking that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Wonderful.
So big thank you to the Foreign Correspondents Club for organizing this series, and especially for highlighting the all-encompassingly important topic of gender equality and women's empowerment. And special thanks to Lakshmi for sharing the extraordinary work of UNWomen and celebrating some of the real achievements that UNWomen has made, and for your wonderful years of leadership there. Since the context of today's discussion is the 75th anniversary of the UN, and since birthdays are a time both to look forward, but also to look back a little and take stock and see where we came from, I'd like to start by taking us back a little bit in history and recalling a few highlights of the overall role in the development of
I think we'll have to technically bear with the fact that Renata may have to, we may lose her from time to time because of the storm. Um, I don't know, connectivity will remain an issue. Venkat, we can't hear you, Venkat. You have to switch your audio on.
Yes, I think whenever she's able to come and join us, we'll go ahead with that. And in the meanwhile, let's get on with it. And
Yeah.
Munish, I
Okay.
may request you to
Wonderful.
ask our participants to ask a question
Yeah.
to Lakshmi. Thank you.
Vichitra, while we wait for Renato to come back and join us, let's start with you and let's see what you have to say in terms of comment and a quick question to Lakshmi. Or wait a minute, maybe if you can wait a minute, Renata is back with us. Renata, continue, and we understand that you have a storm, so you might be in and out, but we'll deal with it.
I'm very sorry. Very,
That's okay.
very sorry about that. Excuse me, and we may get cut again, so my sincere apologies for that. But I wanted to, Lakshmi has already highlighted some of them, but I think some of them merit highlighting again because it really goes back, for example, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which was the first global statement of the inalienable rights of all human beings with explicit mention of the equal rights of women. And then in 1979, the UN General Assembly adopted what we call the Women's Bill of Rights.
Okay, we lost her again. We'll try to play this. I'm sorry, but usually this is not the way we do it, but it's okay. Technical glitches are a part of the game. Vichitra, go ahead if you have a brief comment and a question for Lakshmi. You have to switch your audio on, Vichitra. Please switch on your audio. Unmute yourself, please. Yeah,
All
you're
right.
on.
Now you can hear me. So,
Yes,
okay,
please.
my question was
Yeah.
really in connection to COVID and lockdown. With post-COVID financing by governments, all governments have had these various countries are coming up with the stimulus packages. Any of these packages are focusing on GEWE, or where should they be focusing and prioritizing given the lockdown conditions that women went through? That is, many have lost their jobs, the formal spaces have reduced, there has been a lot of domestic work, domestic violence. So, any of these priorities, the stimulus packages which the governments are introducing around the world, are they addressing any of these issues? I think that's really for Renata, right? I don't know, Lakshmi, have you been up on this area of policy?
Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Vichitra, and wonderful to see you again and to reconnect. No, I have been following this. I cannot say with great authority as to which other countries, etc. But I know that the UN has been trying in different sectors to ensure that gender equality and UNWomen in particular have these templates on how gender equality and women's empowerment issues need to be addressed, as I said, in the three core areas that governments are struggling with and are seeking to get to address as they climb out of this pandemic-related crisis, multi-sectoral crisis, multi-dimensional crisis. The first one is on relief and mitigation. So, and particularly relief and mitigation in developing countries, targeting women who are doubly disadvantaged, poor, rural, living in remote areas, whose livelihood and sustenance has been disrupted. So that's one category. and then, how do you give relief to them? Then there are a whole, in fact, I have my own vision of how this should be done, and I presented at a recent greater than 50 FICCI event, where I talked about how in 7 areas, or what I call the 7 chakras of energy, centers of energy that we need to activate in order to empower women in the process of economic renaissance of, say, India. And in that context, I have addressed how gender equality and women's empowerment should be addressed in the humanitarian and disaster response infrastructure rebuilding, because many countries are now reassessing how this whole response has to be, and the resilience has to be organized in the future and in the present. And a number of initiatives have been taken, whether in the Garib Yojana, or in Atmanirbhar Bharat, where women are targeted specifically, or in transversal programs they are supported, whether it's Jan Dhan, or whether it is the shelters, because homes are also very important parts of providing support. So whether it is PMAY, provision of food, and also cooking gas, all of these relief related, mitigation related, and also Manrega, how to target that to get women to uptake this benefit. So all of that is one. The other is how they can be served in terms of their health needs, because that's the second chakra, which is the health aspect. This has compromised, the pandemic has compromised. So universal access for women, or in all circumstances, to healthcare, particularly sexual and reproductive healthcare, that is really an important issue. But also, how can we make them agents of change, as well as workers and entrepreneurs in this new ecosystem that is being built up on health infrastructure expansion, greater investment in health. Equally, there is the economy itself. There are a number of measures being taken, including MSMEs, supply chain rejigging, rebuilding, creating, all of that. How can we include women entrepreneurs, women workers, more employment to women? How can the recreation be also about a gender equal workplace? All of that has to be addressed. Technology 4.0, and the future of work. So there again, how can we bridge the digital gender gap? How can we also build the education, skilling, reskilling around that, to enable women not to be left behind even further? So in all of these areas, there have to be specific measures and policies and programs, both transversal and targeted. Similarly, another great area of support and targeted government action is gender responsive budgeting, which must be really looked at very carefully, again in the context of the financial reorganization that is at the fiscal pressures that are being put on governments. But gender responsive budgeting and setting aside, and also financing the gender programs in each ministry, for example, or each sector or area, that is very important at this time. That it should not be that just because it's a crisis, we can set aside the gender considerations. So I think all of that is being highlighted by the UN as well, and certainly by all those who are gender equality advocates at this time. It's a big opportunity. It's not, and we should not let it go to when we are trying to rebuild and recreate. And some forces are operating in a spontaneous way, like technology, digital work and the gig economy. How can women participate and benefit from that? All of that must be really, the whole governance structures must be supportive. The ecosystems must be supportive of women's increased participation, their economic empowerment, and certainly norm change. There's a lot of humor going around about unpaid care work and domestic work being shared by men, and in the lockdown, and hopefully it's not only about humor, but it's about new habits forming and more equitable burden sharing, as well as realizing the value of women being able to work from home, because a lot of in India, for example, 30% from 34%, the workforce participation in the formal sector of women has gone down to something like 24%. So, and part of the reason is that for childcare and in childbearing age women, drop off. So we call it the leaking pipeline and motherhood penalty and all of that. And many of them choose to work from home. And that has been stigmatized in the past. But now, hopefully, that men have to do it, work from home, and the gig economy of 0-hour work, flexible work, all of that hopefully will change the whole concept of work itself and women at work, and give them more flexibility. But it should not also, of course, put more burden on them, as it is in some cases. So these are many of the considerations that have been highlighted, and certainly I've been highlighting them in my writing and advocacy.
Great, thank you. I think we have Renata back with us, so I would request her to briefly continue and complete her comments, and then we'll go to the rest of the interaction. Renata, if you could please.
Yes, thank you so much, and apologies again for the technical interruption. I was basically highlighting some of the successes of the whole women's movement. And that women's movement is, of course, universal. It's not just at the UN, but the UN is the only big platform that really brings it all together on a 100% inclusive manner. And before I finish this part, I would just like to say that much of this work was championed and supported in various ways by India. I mean, not only Lakshmi Puri's service to UNWomen, but going way, way back, it was Hansa Mehta, India's delegate to the UN Human Rights Commission in 1948, who actually ensured that the opening of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads, all human beings are created equal, and not all men are created equal, which is what the draft said that came across her desk. And thank God she didn't remain sitting after she got that draft. And it was also Lakshmi Menon who urged that women should be explicitly mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because just implicit or implying, she felt was not enough, and she was definitely right. And on another front, India was the very first country to send an all-women police contingent to join the UN mission in Liberia. And this is extremely significant because not only did they actually contribute, technically and professionally to peacekeeping, but they also served as role models for young Liberian girls who saw them doing this extraordinary work that they'd never seen performed other than by men. And that encouraged quite a few of them to actually think of joining the security forces in their own country. So they were role models on top of their professional support to the mission. And the government of India has also been very supportive of the Secretary General's efforts to end violence, sexual violence in conflict. And these and other efforts, of course, led to the really landmark Security Council resolution passed in 2009, which makes gender violence during a conflict an actual crime punishable under international human rights law and international criminal law. So all these efforts together over the years, I think it's important for us to think back and recognize them, because there's so many challenges in front of us, and we shouldn't let them get us down, because we've actually made progress over time. We've actually reached parity in primary education between boys and girls, which is amazing. We were so far from that only a few decades ago. And the average global maternal mortality rate has also declined by 38%. It's an indicator that's really hard to budge, because it's complex and it's difficult to change, but it has declined by nearly 40%. It's still far too high. There's still an enormous amount of work to do. But the very fact that we've collectively been able to bring it down, I think we should celebrate. And globally, on average, just picking up from what Lakshmi said, many more men are actually helping out at home, not only because of COVID, but generally speaking, after the birth of a child. Way back in 1974, only Sweden provided paternity leave. And now there are some 94 countries that do that. So we know that behaviors are the hardest things to change, but even on behaviors, we're actually being able to put a dent into things. But the challenges are enormous, and a huge amount of work remains to be done. We should just encourage ourselves that change is possible. And as long as technology is with me, which it seems to be, let me say a few words about the UN in India. In line with our normative and knowledge sharing roles, we've done a lot of sharing of international best practices and contributed over the years to a number of very important pieces of national legislation, either new legislation or also amendments to previous pieces of legislation. I'll just cite here the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, the Sexual Harassment of Women at the Workplace Act, the national policy, the draft national policy on women, and the Trafficking of Persons bill. We also submitted suggestions to the Justice Verma Committee, which was established, as you know, by the government to recommend amendments to the criminal law. And we made submissions to the Justice Mehta Commission, basically established to improve safety and security for women in the National Capital Region. And other areas, important areas of the UN support to work in India for gender equality and women's empowerment are around the whole issue of getting under the national average, because in a country such as India, which is so diverse, national averages don't tell you the whole story by any means. And so, for example, the UN supported the engendering of the last national census in 2011, which was an important step forward. We worked with the Ministry of Women and Child Development in computing for the first time state-level gender development and empowerment measures. We also supported, as Lakshmi mentioned, the effort ongoing in the country on gender budgeting, formulating with many partners, of course, a scheme on gender budgeting way back in 2007. Of course, these are like delicate sprouts that need to germinate and need to be taken forward, and particularly in a crisis such as COVID-19. We've also supported the government and partners in efforts preventing and responding to gender-based violence, including inputs towards the important hospital-based one-stop crisis centers for survivors of sexual violence, as well as to put an end to child marriage and fetal sex selection. The list is long, but let me just list two more things that I think we're quite proud of. The UN is very proud to have supported work that led to recent legislation to protect and respect persons marginalized due to sexual orientation and gender identities. And finally, an important area of our work where a lot of programs are focused on is the promotion of women's economic empowerment both through programs that directly address underprivileged women to improve their skills and make them more marketable, as well as through analytical work like studies on female labor force participation. But as I said before, despite all this good work that the UN has done, we don't do any of it on our own. We do it always in partnership, and none of what I've just cited and much more could have been accomplished without those valuable partnerships, be they with civil society or with government. we know that this is very much unfinished business. And only this week, the UN Secretary General.
Okay. I think just around the time that Renata was finishing, that we lost her again. I'm sure she'll join us back. But we love the comments both from Lakshmi and Renata. And I couldn't agree with you more, Lakshmi, that you have to turn adversity into opportunity. And this is the best time in the new order to address a few challenges relating to women. Also, I think, role model, Rwanda, huge. A small country in Africa proves gender parity more than anybody else. Renata, you just want to, do you want to conclude very quickly? Then we have a few interactions.
Yeah, sure. So I was just saying that only this week, which of course is the beginning of the 75th General Assembly, the Secretary General said to the General Assembly that gender inequality remains our greatest single challenge to human rights. And he also placed discrimination against women in the 21st century on a par with the blight of slavery and colonialism from previous centuries. So I think that the work ahead is enormous, and the COVID virus has really laid bare how fractured and unequal our world is. And it's become clear now more than ever how vulnerable women remain, and how generally they're the first to lose their livelihoods in an economic crisis. And when we asked the world to shelter in place against COVID, so many women were so far from being safe in their homes. So as we face these stark realities squarely, at the same time, we mustn't let them deflate us. We must remain energized, partly by the good work that we've been doing over the decades, but also just by the knowledge that exponential change can occur just by getting women a seat at the table. Women can do miracles. There's no better investment, no matter in what country, city, or village, than the investment in women. And I hope that this COVID crisis can serve as a catalyst, as an opportunity to do much more to help the marginalized, and particularly women, because now we need more than ever before, we need solidarity. So the UN can help with this if member states allow it and everyone allows it. We know the UN is still a very imperfect instrument. It's in need of reform, but it's still the best hope we have for addressing the most complex global challenges of our day. And despite its flaws and despite stubborn resistance to reform, sometimes coming from the same member states that are calling for reform, the UN's been moving towards something more than an organization, something more like a global network of alliances, movements, and marches, citizens and countries. And there's no other platform like it today. Such a platform is really important for so many global issues, but it's particularly important for the most vulnerable and for safeguarding the rights of girls and women against violence and prejudice, against every glass ceiling in their way, and every other impediment to their full equality and empowerment.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Renata. That was very, very succinct, very clear, and we couldn't agree with you more. There is nothing like UN, but of course it needs reform. Let me move on to the interaction. Sanjeev, do you have a quick comment and question? I'll start with you and then come back to you.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you to both our guests for doing this. You both have actually covered what I was thinking of, but can I just ask, maybe just turn it back, and you've both referred to it, the disproportionate impact on women of this crisis, this once in a century crisis that we are all in. My question is, where is the UN in all this? Is there any plan? Is there any specific plan for women? As they're taking the hit, as Renate also mentioned, and is there something specific in the works to address this? Thank you.
Renata, you want to take that? Renata, did you hear the question? Are you around?
Let
Lakshmi, if you want to take that.
Well, let me say that I'm aware that UNWomen has, and this is my second-hand knowledge, because as I mentioned, I'm no longer there, but I know, and I have been reading reports about how in each region and in the countries where UNWomen has a presence on the ground, they have been working with governments to gender mainstream all the strategies and responses that governments have been forging to deal with the special challenges that women and girls face in this situation. I mentioned some of them in the context of India, but I'm sure there are similar ones, particularly, as Renata said, to address the situation that marginalized communities and women and girls in marginalized communities find themselves in. There are issues in every sector that have to be addressed. I mentioned some of them: education, technology, livelihood, jobs. Most of the women are in informal jobs. How do you support them when they lose those in the context of contactless work? Then there are so many other challenges that need to target women's special needs. And I want to come back to this whole issue of violence, the shadow pandemic of domestic violence that women and girls have been increasingly subjected to in the context of the COVID pandemic and the measures, the homestay and the lockdown and everything else also subsequent to the lockdown, because this has been indeed more oppressive for women. And how do we deal with that? So 2 or 3 things that I think the UN has been advocating is to treat the crisis response, domestic violence crisis response services, the one-stop centers, the hotlines, whatever is required, as an essential service, which must be operated throughout. So that is something that must be done and must be available to women and girls on a universal basis. Access to contraceptives, family planning services during this time. All of these are really very, very important recommendations and inputs that and services. I think the UN is also involved in providing some of these services in countries.
Is Renata back? Just checking very quickly. Anil, can you go back to the multi-screen? Renata, if you're back, do you want to add something to this, or should we move on to? Renata is not there. So Purnima, she joined back. Purnima, do you have a quick comment or a question? Unmute yourself, please. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So basically, I feel that a person, if he or she is empowered, there are less chances of a crime against her. Right to property, yes, Supreme Court has recently clarified about it that daughters have equal right in ancestral property. Hindu Succession Act would have retrospective effect. The amendment would have retrospective effect. So if we look at in Indian context, in agriculture also, there are more women who are working on agricultural land, but they don't own the land. Women don't have enough property in their names. They don't own properties, the houses or land or immovable assets they don't own. I would like to quote here Professor Beena Agrawal's study, wherein she has mentioned in her study, which she did in Kerala, that where there are property or immovable asset in women's name, where they own property, there are less crimes against women. There are you would get to see lower rate, child mortality rate. There are less marital violence you would get to see. So right to property or women have very less share in property. In Indian context, if we look at socialization is such that parents even focus on or preparing their daughters for marriage, not for life. they don't train them for life, as in what they do in families, that she has to go to other house. So at the time of marriage, what we see is that they give a lot of gifts which should have been given in her name. Rather than giving gold to her, they should have given us, even if a small house, they could, if they can own one room or whatever. So right to property is an important part of her life for her social security, not for building any other asset or whatever, but to give her social security, which is something, if she doesn't have social security, she becomes a soft target to many crimes after marriage, be domestic violence or any other thing. Other thing is that we have seen in 2019 elections that women have voted almost equally with men, and there was the difference was 0.4% only. So when we are equally voting, the vote share is equal, and there are only 14% women reaching in parliament. The policy makers, those who are making policies for us, their participation is and we are the half voters, but our participation in parliament is only 14%. What can we expect from them? So there are certain things which I feel that economic empowerment is very important part. Women labor force participation, as Lakshmi Puri ji mentioned, is just 23-24% in our country. So in organized sectors, women are not there. If they're not empowered, then all the problems would arise. If they don't have the house in which they are living in their name, then these problems are going to arise. So probably they would need legal help. Because it's the family which is not giving, it's the brother who is not giving them share in the properties, the father who is giving share to his son, or if he has to if he has set a will, then it is given to the son, not to the daughter. So what UNWomen can do in this area, if a lady wants to claim her right in property, how can that be done? That I would like to ask Renita and Lakshmi ji both.
Any one of you want to respond to that? Lakshmi, Renata?
If Renata is there, maybe she responds on the UN side, and if I could say something on India.
Please go ahead. We'll catch on with.
Okay. So, one of the major targets of SDG 5 is economic empowerment. And economic empowerment, key aspect of that and autonomy is access, ownership, and control over land and other resources, property, the natural resources. If you can even talk about water, irrigation, all of those aspects that happen that also come into play in rural areas. Also, the inheritance is a very important point that has been also mentioned in that target, and related issues of finance, entrepreneurship, skills, and all that is needed for economic empowerment. But access, ownership, and control, these are the three aspects. So I entirely agree with you that it is critical. Now, that is why I think the Modi government has been very committed to making sure that the women's ownership of housing, for example, in PMAY, and this is an example I always give because it's really a spectacular example, that in the Housing for All programs, there are, I think, 4 verticals. And because there is a rule that women have to be the owners or co-owners of any houses that benefit from this program, which is a subvention or a loan, 89%, in most cases, 89% of the beneficiaries are women. And that has really raised the ownership of women, of property ownership of women. So that's one way the state can ensure. But of course, I entirely agree with you. And I know that when I was there, I remember two spectacular examples of how legislation or incentives or disincentives can change mindset and also the behavior, as Renata mentioned, of say the fathers or the husbands. Is in Kyrgyzstan they made it a law that every property has to be registered in the name of a woman or in joint ownership. And that really raised naturally the ownership of property. Similarly, and we worked with the government to support that legislation. In Nepal, I remember that there was an incentive, a tax benefit given, and I know that it is also there in India in some way. Tax benefit given if you register your property in a woman's name. So these are the kind of ways in which you can move the needle on this.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask very quickly, Munish, a quick question, Munish Chan, or comment? We have very little time left, but I want both of you, and Veera, to come in.
Back also, yeah.
Renata is back.
Unmute.
Munish, you have to unmute, please.
Yeah. No, first, thanks.
Okay.
Powerful and stirring speeches, presentations by both speakers. My question is this, that Lakshmi Puri spoke about gender responsive budgeting, in fact, both the speakers, and basically creating a gender responsive, global architecture and all that, and decision making. But women remain very underrepresented in diplomatic institutions. For example, I don't know, in Indian Foreign Service, of course, there are women who are rising, and we had a few foreign secretaries. And of course, Lakshmi Puri herself is an exemplar of the success. But nonetheless, they remain underrepresented. And even at the rate of 75, we haven't had a woman Secretary General. Basically, what I am asking is that, where you started off by saying that gender issues remain a soft sort of subject. When we have bilateral summits, gender issues, if at all they figure, they are like footnotes, They don't get the kind of prominence they deserve. And so it goes to culture and people to people. So how can we have, since running out of time, gender responsive diplomacy and enhance the representation of women in the diplomatic world? Thank you.
Renata, do you want to answer that, please, since we have you back?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please.
Great. No, thanks so much for the question. I guess there's several ways of looking at it. When I look back, I've been with the system for a very long time now, more than 3 decades, I'm embarrassed to say. And I have participated in diplomatic communities in many, many countries. And I would say that in the last 15 years in particular, you really saw a shift. You saw a shift in terms of far more female ambassadors. And in fact, in one of my previous countries of assignment, the diplomatic community was virtually half female and the other half male. I'm not saying it's the same everywhere, but I think there is progress there. Within the UN itself, we've had successive secretary generals who've placed a very strong emphasis, particular, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the predecessor of Antonio Guterres himself. And it took a long time, but at the senior levels of the UN right now, we have reached parity. And there's parity at virtually all levels. As you know, the highest level of any institution is the hardest to get parity at. And so we've reached parity. There are some parts of the middle of the echelon, if you like to, if you will, where we have still some way to go. But at the very top, there's now parity. I think it's extremely important. We have some of the Scandinavian countries that have shown us, for example, what it means to in the boardrooms when they insist that there be 40%, 30%, 40%, or even 50% of women in company boardrooms. It makes a huge difference for company policy and for their investment decisions. So I, for one, can say that the UN has made some progress here, important progress. there are not all that many institutions that can claim parity at the very senior levels of its ranks, and the UN can do that now.
Munish, we have seen foreign secretaries, foreign ministers, prime ministers of India, all women. So unless Lakshmi wants to add something, I want to quickly, in the interest of time, move on to Veer, because he has not participated at all. Veer, Synergia Foundation, I know your work, but any interesting twist to what you want to ask the ladies?
No, I just think that the bad decisions are because we haven't had parity, but we leave that aside. I just want a quick clarification from Ms. Puri on what she said. She said about formal sector, 34% to 24% drop in employment of women. Is that specifically about the lockdown period you're talking about, or is that larger, this one? And also, do you have any sort of data to suggest, you've sort of identified the sectors? Is there any data to suggest any sort of sub-regional divide in India, as in which regions have fared better during this COVID period and post that, in terms of on these issues?
No. When I said 34% was there, I think in 2015 or something. And from then to now, there has been a decline, and there have been studies which have been done. Most of the decline is on account of two factors. One, as I said, this pipeline of recruitment, retention, promotion, and then the leaking pipelines phenomenon due to care responsibilities, as well as the value chain of education, skills, and employment not being as supportive as it should be, the ecosystem. So I think these are two factors that need to be addressed. As for state-wise analysis on, first of all, on the crisis impact, I'm sure, as I've said, because most women are in informal sector, employed in informal sector, including domestic work, by the way. Domestic workers, something like 80% are employed. Then even in the formal sector, they are in areas like electronics, textiles, and garments, and so on. So women have taken a big hit. But of course, they are also, and in teaching, as teachers, as you all know. So many of these gender intensive sectors where there has been a stoppage, of course, women suffer. But I'm not aware, I've not looked into state-wise studies on these matters. I want to just quickly come back to Purnima's question on parliamentary representation. And I always quote this is my favorite quote about, that one woman can represent all women better than many women or all men can represent one woman. So that is definitely the case. And in terms of in India, I think we have seen tremendous progress made because we had reservation. And I want to really make a very clear case for the Women's Reservation Bill as far as our parliament is concerned. And I know it's in the BJP manifesto, and I hope that it will be taken up soon, because that's the level where, and the state assembly, some of the state assemblies have taken their own decisions and have gone forward. I think Orissa, but we at the state assembly level and at the parliament level, we do need a reservation policy till such time as ecosystem is created whereby spontaneously parity is assured, as it happened in Rwanda, where 66%, in fact, it's the other way around, 66% of parliamentarians are women. So, and this has been a major program. We have worked with political parties, the UN Women's major program on the ground, and we have struck gold, for example, in Senegal, we worked for legislation on this. And there was a tremendous success because legislation was passed, having a quota for women. And because of that, there has now been a transformation. And as it happened on the ground in the panchayats or in the Jilla Parishads, women are now on their own defeating their men candidates without needing any reservation. So I think that's something, that revolution has to come through specific, what we call special temporary measures or temporary special measures.
Thank you for that response. I can endorse the fact that as I travel through developing countries, there is tremendous amount of work being done by the United Nations, both on a political level and on the other side, for example, menstrual hygiene and health, and on nutrition and education. And I think that all put together goes a long way in creating women's empowerment and really making a big difference in the world. UNWomen has certainly brought up that issue to the fore of women empowerment, and that's good work. In the interest of time, Venkat, I now switch back to you for your concluding remarks and vote of thanks. Venkat, you have to switch your audio on, please.
Yeah.
Okay, you're on.
There is no question that there has been a tremendous increase or development as far as women are concerned. But I want to say that the political representation of women has literally doubled in the last 25 years. Yet the fact remains that the percentage of women in parliaments across the globe is only 25%. That is, every fourth member of parliament globally is a woman. And it's only in 22 countries that you have a woman president or prime minister now, as against 12 countries 25 years ago, which had women presidents and prime ministers. Let's take the Fortune 500 global companies. Out of them, only 35 of the CEOs happen to be women at this point of time. And this
Venkat, you have muted yourself. Can you unmute yourself? No.
I think the system has muted him.
Anil, can you check?
So even though the number of educated women has gone up considerably, the gender gap in the labor force has stagnated for the last 25 years, 20 years. And only 53 of the 900 individuals who won the Nobel Prizes during the past 100 years happen to be women. Things are no better in other places like sports, entertainment, films, television, and so on. I think, in spite of the fact that a considerable amount of progress has been achieved during the past 25 years, particularly after UNWomen came into existence, we have a long way to go. I'm sure that dynamic ladies like Lakshmi and Renata and will be able to do something about this. And the next 25 years, hopefully, the number of women in our parliaments or the list of Nobel Prize winners or Fortune 500 will double or more than double, and that would be a wonderful thing. I want to thank Lakshmi, Renata, Purnima, Vichitra, Sanjeev, Munish, and Veera for taking part in this very interesting and educative webinar. As I said, this was our second webinar to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Last week we had Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Vijay Nambiar, Bhaswati Mukherjee, and Syed Akbaruddin. If there are any more other interesting subjects to discuss, we may even have one more. But meanwhile, I want to conclude here by saying thank you very much, all of you, for joining this webinar. This is the end of the webinar. Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone. We conclude.